A 7-year-old boy walked down to the edge of Pyramid Lake in Nevada in the summer of 1993, chasing a garter snake through the reeds. And he never walked back. For 33 years, his mother kept his fishing rod in the garage, exactly where he'd left it, leaning against the wall. Then, in the spring of 2026, a routine blood test at a job site in Arizona flagged something in a federal database that had been sitting untouched for 3 decades. What it found wasn't a grave. It was a 40-year-old man standing in a break room, being told by 2 strangers in windbreakers that his entire life was built on a name that wasn't his. This is the story of how Owen Ramirez came home. Pyramid Lake sits about 40 minutes northeast of Reno. A strange, beautiful stretch of blue water dropped into high desert scrubland tufa formations, rising out of it like something from another planet. In 1993 it was, as it still is, tribal land belonging to the Pyramid Lake Paiute, and it drew fishermen from all over northern Nevada for the Lahontan cutthroat trout that grew nowhere else in the world the way they grew there. Daniel Ramirez took his son Owen out to the lake most Saturdays that summer. Just the 2 of them. An old ritual that had started when Owen was barely old enough to hold a rod steady. Owen was 7 that July. Small for his age, missing both front teeth. The kind of boy who narrated everything he did out loud whether or not anyone was listening. His mother, Alana, would say later that the sound of him talking to himself was the thing she missed most in the years that followed. More than his face, more than anything else. He had a 4-year-old sister at home, Sophia, too young that summer to remember much of what came after, though she would spend most of her adult life trying anyway. The desert around the lake in July had its own particular character. Heat that came off the water in a shimmer by mid-morning, the smell of sage and dry grass carried on wind that never really stopped moving across that basin. The cry of pelicans that nested on the lake's islands and circled overhead most mornings before the fishermen arrived. Daniel kept an old green cooler in the truck bed that Owen liked to sit on while his father rigged the lines, and Alana packed the same lunch every Saturday that summer. Bologna sandwiches and red grapes, because Owen would eat nothing else on fishing days and had said so with the total certainty only a 7-year-old can manage. The drive out from Reno took them past a scatter of small ranches and a single gas station where Daniel always stopped for the same brand of soda. A routine so fixed that neighbors later said they could have set a clock by it. Nevada in 1993 still felt, in that stretch of desert, like a place where a family could disappear for a Saturday and no one would think to worry, because nothing out there had ever given anyone reason to. The morning Owen disappeared was, by every account, unremarkable in every way except the one that mattered. Daniel had waded out to a sandbar to work a lure loose from a snag, 30, maybe 40 feet from shore. Close enough to hear Owen, but not close enough to see him every second. Owen had been sitting on a rock near the reeds, and at some point he'd spotted a garter snake moving through the grass and gone after it the way any 7-year-old would, delighted, unafraid, certain the world was made of small good things worth chasing. Daniel called out to him twice from the water without an answer. Thought nothing of it at first because Owen wandered constantly and always turned up within shouting distance, and by the time he waded back in and walked the shoreline calling his son's name, 10 minutes, maybe 15, had passed. He would spend the rest of his life unable to say for certain exactly how long, and that uncertainty, more than almost anything else about that day, ate at him until the day he died. By the time Daniel reached the rock where Owen had last been sitting, the boy's small tackle box was still there, open, a few lures scattered where he'd left them mid-play. There was no sign of a struggle in the reeds, no disturbed brush leading toward the water, nothing that suggested Owen had gone in after the snake and slipped. Daniel would tell investigators over and over across the following weeks that the scene simply looked like a boy who had stood up and walked away, and that the ordinariness of it was somehow worse than any sign of violence would have been, because it left him nothing to explain to himself. The search that followed drew on resources few rural disappearances got in that era, largely because Pyramid Lake's remoteness meant everyone available converged fast and hard. Tribal police, Washoe County Sheriff's deputies, and volunteers from 3 nearby towns combed the shoreline and the scrubland behind it within hours. By nightfall of the first day, more than 60 people were working the search area, some on foot, some on horseback, working outward in a grid from the rock where Owen had last been sitting. Search dogs worked the reeds where Owen had last been seen and lost his trail near a gravel turnout used by fishermen and campers, a detail that troubled investigators from the very first day, because a lost or drowned child does not typically produce a scent trail that simply stops at a parking area. Divers searched the shallows near where Daniel had been standing, and then wider, working outward for 2 full days using equipment brought in from Reno's dive team, and found nothing. Not a shoe, not a hat, nothing at all belonging to a boy who by every account had been standing in that exact spot less than an hour before he vanished. Detective Marion Sato caught the case in her 2nd year with the Washoe County Sheriff's Office, 29 years old that summer, and already known around the department for a stubbornness her colleagues alternately respected and found exhausting. Case files from that first month, reviewed decades later, showed 2 competing theories running side by side inside the department, one holding that Owen had drowned in a stretch of water known for sudden drop-offs close to shore, the other, which Sato pushed hardest, holding that a person had been involved given the total absence of any physical trace the lake typically surrendered even in drowning cases. It was Sato who pushed hardest on the gravel turnout, and Sato who eventually got a partial account from a Reno area gas station attendant who remembered, vaguely, a camper van with out-of-state plates buying gas and snacks that same morning. A man alone at the pump who the attendant thought had seemed, in his word, jumpy. No plate number was ever recovered. No composite sketch produced anything actionable. Tips trickled in for the better part of a year. A boy resembling Owen spotted at a truck stop in Idaho, a family that had moved abruptly from a trailer park outside Reno, each one logged, each one eventually cleared by a department already stretched thin across the county. Sato logged the tip about the camper van, flagged it in her own case notes as the most promising lead the file had, and watched the trail go cold anyway, the way trails did in an era before cameras were everywhere and before a stranger's face could be run against a database in seconds. Owen Ramirez did not let the case rest, not for a single one of the 33 years that followed. She wrote to the sheriff's office every July, on the anniversary, for over a decade, and kept every reply, even the ones that said, in careful official language, that there was nothing new to report. Daniel Ramirez returned to Pyramid Lake alone every summer for almost 20 years, walking the same stretch of shoreline at the same time of day, a ritual Alina said she never asked him to explain, because she understood it without needing to. Neighbors said Daniel rarely spoke of those trips afterward, that he would simply return quiet and withdrawn for a day or two before going back to himself. He died in 2015, having never learned what happened to his son, a fact Alina still says, decades later, with a flatness that carries more weight than tears would. Sophia grew up carrying a version of guilt that never belonged to her, the guilt of the sibling who was home that day and somehow felt responsible anyway, and she became, over the following decades, the keeper of the family's records, the newspaper clippings, the case number, the name of every detective who ever touched the file, because someone needed to hold all of it, and by her 60s, Alina said she no longer had the strength to hold it alone. Marian Sato stayed with the case longer than almost anyone expected her to. She made detective sergeant by 1999, and lieutenant a decade after that. And through every promotion, she kept her own working copy of the Ramirez file, updating it herself whenever a new piece of missing persons technology came online. Whenever a new database was built that hadn't existed the year before. She ran Owen's information through every system Washoe County gained access to over the following 3 decades: ENSIC updates, new facial aging software in the early 2000s, and later, quietly, the genetic databases that were just beginning to reshape cold case work nationwide. Sato retired in 2018 without an answer, but she left her successor a single instruction on the Ramirez file, typed and taped to the inside cover: keep this one active, no matter what. By 1998, 5 years gone, Alina had stopped updating Owen's missing posters with an aged photograph, unable to keep looking at a face her own imagination had to invent. By 2003, 10 years gone, Daniel had taken to calling the sheriff's office every few months just to hear a human voice tell him nothing had changed, because somehow that was better than silence. By 2013, 20 years gone, Sophia was raising a daughter of her own and found she could not let the girl near open water without standing directly beside her. A vigilance her own daughter would later inherit without ever fully understanding where it came from. Alina kept Owen's fishing rod leaning in the same corner of the garage through 2 moves and 1 flood that ruined nearly everything else stored down there, an object she could never explain keeping, only that she had. If you've stayed with us this far, you already know how rarely a case like this ends any way but one. Subscribe now, because what happened next to this family had never happened in Washoe County before. For most of 3 decades, that was where the story sat. A mother who never stopped writing letters. A detective who never stopped updating a file she no longer had to touch. A father who walked the same shoreline every summer until his body gave out. And then, in March of 2026, a maintenance worker named Curtis Doyle, 40 years old, living outside Flagstaff, Arizona, went in for a routine occupational health screening required by his employer. A blood panel that, as part of a new state pilot program aimed at identifying long-term missing persons through incidental biometric data, was cross-checked against a federal missing persons genetic index most patients had never heard existed. Doyle had grown up believing he was the son of a man named Frank Doyle, a drifter with a string of short-term jobs across 4 states who had raised him alone, moving often, never settling, always with an explanation ready for why they couldn't go back to wherever they'd just left. Curtis had no memory of any life before Arizona, roughly age 8, and Frank had always told him his mother died when he was a baby, and that there simply weren't any records worth keeping from before that. The screening flagged a match 5 weeks later. An automated notice that traveled quietly from a state lab to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and from there directly to the Washoe County Sheriff's Office, where it landed, by pure administrative coincidence, on the desk of a young detective who had been trained, years earlier, by a since-retired lieutenant named Marian Sato. The detective drove to Sato's home in Sparks that same afternoon rather than call, and later said that Sato, 79 years old and reportedly slowing down in nearly every other part of her life, was out the door and in the passenger seat of the department car before he'd finished explaining why he'd come. Sato would later tell a colleague that she had run through this exact scenario in her head so many times over 3 decades that when it finally happened, it felt less like a surprise and more like something she had simply been waiting to finish. What followed was 4 careful weeks of confirmation before anyone told Elena Ramirez anything at all. A DNA sample was drawn from Curtis Doyle with his informed consent. Once investigators explained what the flag meant, and compared against a sample the Ramirez family had preserved almost by accident. A lock of Owen's hair Alana had cut and kept in a small box the week before he vanished, meant originally for a baby book that was never finished. The comparison took 9 days. The result left no room for doubt. Curtis Doyle was Owen Ramirez. Investigators moved quickly once the identity was confirmed, turning next to Frank Doyle, 74, and living alone in a trailer outside Flagstaff in declining health. Confronted with a Dina match and a detective across the table from him, Frank Doyle did not hold out long. What he described was not a plan carried out in advance, but something investigators struggled, even afterward, to fully categorize. He said he had stopped at Pyramid Lake that July morning for gas and to stretch his legs after driving through the night. A man with no children of his own and a history, unmentioned in any record until that interview, of 2 prior stints in county jail for offenses he characterized only as trouble I made for myself. He said he saw a boy alone near the reeds, no adult visible from where he stood, and told himself, in the space of a few minutes, a story that let him do what he did next, that the boy was unsupervised, uncared for, better off. He put Owen in the camper van and crossed into a second state before nightfall. He gave him a new name within days. He told him, once Owen was old enough to ask questions, that his mother had died and there was no family left to speak of. And he built an entire wandering life around that lie so completely that 33 years and 4 states later, he told investigators he had, in his own words, started to believe some of it myself, because it was easier than remembering the truth. Neighbors in the trailer park outside Flagstaff, interviewed after the arrest, described Frank Doyle as a quiet, withdrawn man who kept to himself and rarely stayed anywhere longer than a year or 2 before moving again. Always with some plausible reason. A new job. A landlord dispute, whether he didn't care for. Several said they had always found something faintly unsettling about the man they knew as Curtis's father, without ever being able to name what it was. And more than one said, in the days after the story broke, that they had thought of Curtis as a somewhat solitary, careful adult. Someone who kept his own counsel and rarely spoke about his childhood at all. A pattern that made a difficult kind of sense to people once they learned why. The gravel turnout where the search dogs lost Owen's scent in 1993, investigators now believe, was simply where Frank Doyle's camper van had been parked that morning, and the missing scent trail that once seemed so troubling had a plain explanation all along. A car, not a drowning, waiting at the edge of a parking area the whole time. Frank Doyle was arrested and charged with kidnapping in April of 2026. A case complicated by his age and failing health, though the Washoe County District Attorney's Office has stated publicly the prosecution will proceed regardless of how long it takes. For the family, the criminal case, whatever its outcome, was never going to be the point. Alina Ramirez was 71 years old when a detective sat down across from her at her kitchen table and told her that her son was alive. She has said in the only interview she has given since that she did not believe it, not fully, until she watched him walk through her front door 40 years old with her own husband's exact posture, and that the sound she made in that moment, Sophia said afterward, was not a word at all, just the sound of 33 years leaving a body all at once. Owen, who has said he intends to keep the name Curtis in daily life while legally reclaiming Owen Ramirez as his birth name, has described the reunion as grief and relief, arriving in the same instant. Grief for an entire life, and a father he never got to know, folded into something he said he did not know a person could feel at the same time as joy. Sophia Ramirez, 4 years old the summer her brother disappeared and 37 when he came home, has said the hardest part of the last 3 decades was not the not knowing. It was watching her mother hold that not knowing every single day. while there was nothing she could do to lighten it. She has said that in the weeks since Owen's return, she has caught herself simply watching him across a room, still half convinced she will wake from it. A feeling she says she suspects will take years longer than the reunion itself to fully settle. Marian Sato, 80 years old now, was in the room when Owen Ramirez was told his real name for the first time, and she has said publicly only that it was the single best afternoon of her entire career, one she waited 33 years to have. There is a photograph the Ramirez family has kept for all 33 years, one that ran during the original search in 1993 and has run again in every story since the case broke open. It shows Owen at 7 years old, standing at the edge of Pyramid Lake with his father's fishing rod nearly as tall as he was, grinning at the camera with both front teeth missing. Alina has said that for decades she could not look at that photograph without also picturing the empty shoreline beside it, one image fused permanently to the other in her mind. She has said that since this spring, for the first time, she can look at the photograph and see only her son, laughing, safe, exactly as he was before one ordinary Saturday took him away for what everyone believed. For 33 years was the rest of his life. What do you do with 33 years that cannot be handed back? What do you say to a mother who kept a fishing rod leaning in a garage corner for 3 decades on the smallest possible chance it would matter again? And what does it mean that the answer arrived not from a break in the case or a confession, but from a routine blood test at a job site more than 700 miles from a lake in the Nevada desert? Some cases end with a body and a verdict. This one ended with a woman in her 70s, standing in her own kitchen, watching her son walk through the door almost exactly the way he'd walked out of it. 1 lifetime and 33 years later. If this story moved you, stay with us. There are more cases like this one. Cases where the truth took decades to surface, and the people who never stopped waiting were right to hold on. Subscribe, and we'll bring you the next one.